The final days of Alexander the Great, from triumph to tragedy. In the summer of 323 BCE, the vast empire that Alexander the Great had forged, stretching from Greece to the edge of India, stood at the pinnacle of its power. The young king, barely 32 years old, had accomplished what no man before him could have dreamt: the conquest of the Persian Empire, the liberation of Egypt, and the unification of the known world under his rule. Yet, in the span of a few short weeks, this remarkable life would come to a tragic and mysterious end. What had seemed like the apex of Alexander's career, the moment when his empire was poised to expand even further, soon became a moment of irrevocable decline, plunging his empire into chaos and fragmentation. It began in the ancient city of Babylon, in the heart of Mesopotamia, a few weeks after Alexander had returned from his campaign in India. The king had planned to launch further expeditions, possibly towards Arabia or even the Western Mediterranean. But his health took an unexpected turn. On May 29, 323 BCE, Alexander fell ill after a banquet in honor of his latest triumphs. His fever quickly escalated, and for days he was bedridden, weak, and unable to speak. His condition deteriorated rapidly. Historians have long debated the cause of Alexander's mysterious illness, and there are several theories. Some argue that he succumbed to natural causes, such as malaria or typhoid fever, both of which were endemic to the region. The symptoms Alexander experienced, fever, fatigue, and extreme pain, were consistent with these diseases. However, this theory does not account for the suddenness and the intensity of the illness, which many contemporaries found alarming. Another theory, far more sensational, suggests that Alexander was poisoned. Ancient writers such as Justin and Plutarch spoke of rumors that his death had been hastened by the hand of a conspirator. The idea that Alexander might have been assassinated by his own men or political rivals has captivated imaginations for centuries. Given Alexander's volatile relationships with some of his generals and the growing tension within his court, it is not implausible that his death was orchestrated by someone who feared his power or saw his leadership as a threat. Yet, the idea of poisoning raises questions about timing. If he was poisoned, how did his illness develop over several days? Was it a slow-acting poison, or could it have been administered in a way that mimicked natural causes? It is not implausible that his death was orchestrated by someone who feared his power or saw his leadership as a threat. Yet, the idea of poisoning raises questions about timing. If he was poisoned, how did his illness develop over several days? Was it a slow-acting poison, or could it have been administered in a way that mimicked natural causes? Modern medical analysis of ancient texts has suggested that Alexander's symptoms may have pointed to a rare form of autoimmune disease called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which could explain the rapid onset of paralysis and fever. Others suggest that he may have been suffering from pancreatitis, perhaps exacerbated by the heavy drinking at his last banquet. Yet, the true cause of his death remains uncertain, and the mystery only deepens when one considers the political consequences of his demise. As Alexander lay dying, the empire he had built stood on the verge of an uncertain future. For most of his life, he had been the embodiment of his empire, a leader whose charisma and military genius inspired loyalty in his soldiers and fear in his enemies. But Alexander had no clear plan for succession. His half-brother, Aridaeus, was mentally unstable, and his only legitimate son, Alexander IV, was an infant. The great king had never provided a concrete solution to the question of who would inherit his vast empire, and in his final moments, he is said to have murmured the ambiguous words "to the strongest," leaving the matter open to interpretation. In the wake of his death, the empire began to fragment almost immediately. His generals, the so-called diadochi, quickly turned on each other, each one vying for power in a bitter struggle for control. The most notable of these generals included Ptolemy, who would take control of Egypt, Seleucus, who would dominate the eastern territories, and Antigonus, who sought to establish himself as the ruler of Asia Minor. The fragmentation of Alexander's empire marked the beginning of a series of civil wars that would rage for decades, ultimately splitting the empire into several Hellenistic kingdoms. The consequences of Alexander's death rippled far beyond the battlefield. The vision of a unified pan-Hellenistic empire that transcended cultural and national boundaries, the dream that had fueled Alexander's conquests, was now lost. The various successor kingdoms that emerged after his death were often at odds with one another, and the dream of an empire bound by loyalty to a single ruler became increasingly distant. As for Alexander's legacy, it was one of both extraordinary achievement and tragic miscalculation. His soldiers, who had marched with him across the Persian Empire, the deserts of Arabia, and the mountains of India, found themselves aimless without his leadership. They had been motivated not just by the promise of riches, but by an almost religious faith in their king, believing him to be a divine figure, a living god. His death shattered that illusion, and the question of what would come next led many to question the very purpose of their conquests. Meanwhile, in the heart of the ancient world, Babylon, once the center of Alexander's imperial dreams, became a symbol of lost grandeur. The city itself, which Alexander had hoped to make the new capital of his empire, fell into decline as the power of the Macedonian kings fractured. The grand palaces and monuments he had commissioned stood as silent reminders of what might have been. Alexander's mother, Olympias, who had seen her son as a divinely ordained ruler, was heartbroken by his death. She lived to see the empire fragmented and her own family's position weakened by the rivalries that ensued. His generals, once loyal companions, became rivals for control of the vast territories Alexander had conquered, and their battles echoed the same power struggles that had plagued Greece for centuries. Though his empire dissolved, Alexander's legacy lived on in ways that he may not have foreseen. The Hellenistic world, which was forged by his conquests, would continue to influence the culture and politics of the Mediterranean for centuries. His vision of a fusion between Greek and Persian cultures took root in places like Alexandria, where Greek language, art, and philosophy blended with local traditions. And though his empire was fractured, the spirit of Alexander, the idea of a ruler who transcended borders and united diverse peoples under one banner, remained a powerful symbol throughout history. The final days of Alexander the Great were a tragic and mysterious conclusion to a life that had been filled with triumphs and conquests. His sudden death and the disintegration of his empire left a lasting mark on the ancient world. The man who had once seemed invincible was gone, and with him, the dream of an empire that could have changed the course of history. His legacy, however, would endure in the hearts of those who remembered his extraordinary journey across the known world, from triumph to tragedy.